Okay, so let's get started. This is the last half of the last lecture. How cool is that? So we were talking about hominid evolution, and we left off with Homo erectus. Two more recent species in our own genus are Homo neanderthalensis and ourselves. So let's talk about Neanderthal man first. Neanderthalensis, it's named for the Neander Valley in Germany, where the first fossils were found. These guys, first species we've talked about that didn't evolve in Africa. These guys appear in the fossil record from about 400,000 years ago to about 40,000 years ago, across Europe especially, and then a bit of Western Asia as well. This is what we think of when you say caveman. Short, stocky guy, one eyebrow all the way across. These guys had incredibly bad PR. I mean, the first remains were found a long time ago, and that the Europeans at the time were, set on saying that ain't no ancestor of mine, and so they really, I think, went out of their way to picture them, Neanderthals, as being stupid and slow-witted and everything else, and not my relative. Anyway, that, like I said, really bad PR. So these guys were heavy-boned and short. This picture I showed you last time is, on the right is modern Homo sapiens, on the left Neanderthal. They sort of scaled up the Neanderthal because generally they're shorter, maybe like 5'6", 5'8" or so, maybe 5'10". But again, if you go back 100,000 years ago, all of us, and I don't call them modern Homo sapiens because there was a lineage that we call Homo sapiens. It's not quite us, but modern Homo sapiens, we looked like cross-country runners, and Neanderthals looked like linebackers. Little short linebackers, but if you look at the skeleton, their bones were thicker, and they were more sturdy than us. And that sort of makes sense if you understand how they made a living. They made a living in a really challenging way. They took large prey. They killed things like, bison and mammoths and woolly rhinoceros with spears. They didn't throw them, they were thrusting spears. So imagine you and a buddy or two sneak up on a rhino and stab him with a spear. Guess what? It's not dead. Will you be alive 10 seconds from now? And so some really recent biomechanical work has suggested that looking at muscle scars on bones, that Neanderthals, far from being like slow-witted and not very, athletic, were extremely agile and quick. And that would seem to be a really good, important trait if you were going to do this more than once. So that, anyway, that's a tough way to make a living, and that's what they did. They lived across fairly rich habitat. If you want to think about the kind of weather or climate, maybe sort of like today, high mountain Rockies, gets really cold, but it's a rich environment, so lots of prey there. And that they were, again, 400,000 to about 40,000 years ago, they were successful for a long period of time. Now, our species is Homo sapiens. Sapiens means wise. We named ourselves Wise Man. How cool is that? We evolved in Africa. The earliest remains at least 200,000 years ago. Until just a year or two ago, everybody would say 200,000 years ago, but just very recently, and this dates from sort of northeast Africa for the oldest fossils, modern Homo sapiens, somebody found northwest Africa, what perhaps are modern Homo sapiens dating to about 300,000 years ago. And so right now there's a scientific debate going on whether them is us as well, but certainly by 200,000 years ago, modern Homo sapiens were in Africa. We left Africa. And by the way, you may have heard of Cro-Magnon man. It's one of the terms you use for like, like fossil hominid, fossil us. Those dates from like 30, 40,000 years ago. This is when modern Homo sapiens finally got into Europe, which is about 45,000 years ago. That's where those cave paintings and things came from. But by 100,000 years ago, Homo sapiens were leaving Africa. And we didn't head, let me make this a little bigger. So we didn't head up into Europe. We kind of went around the corner. And for a long time, they assumed that we moved along the coast, because if you can forage along the coast here, you can forage along the coast here and here and here and here, and you can keep doing the same thing to survive. The problem is you find no evidence of movements then. And part of it's to be expected because there was so much ice tied up in the poles that sea level was lower. So their coast today, their coast back then is well out into the ocean now. But you should find something. And it wasn't until somebody thought to look across here, and this is really, I don't know, 10, 15 years ago. The Mideast was green, and there were rivers that moved east-west. And that's where modern Homo sapiens were going. One of the things about us, modern Homo sapiens, we travel. Most of the other species, again, Homo erectus, a little bit different, at least they left Africa, but for the most part, hominids find some place where they can survive and they stay there until they can't survive anymore and then they go extinct. We go someplace and say, essentially, this is cool, hey, what's over there? And so by 63,000 years ago, we find the oldest finds from Southeast Asia are from Laos, 63,000 years ago. 42,000 years ago, people were on the far side of Australia. Now, to get across here, even with lower sea level, required several real life ocean voyages. And so that was, again, that was quite an accomplishment. But while we were doing this, while we were traveling, there were some interesting things that happened to us. And we didn't really know about it until they managed to sequence the DNA of a Neanderthal in 2010. Hardly any DNA, and the technology involved in making sense out of that. Again, the group that figured out how to do that, their head guy 2 years before said, no one will ever be able to do this. So it's, in any event, they sequenced a Neanderthal and they found out that most people on Earth have Neanderthal genes. Not a lot, maybe 1.7%, but most people do. And apparently, and based on, again, how much those genes changed over time, the estimate is from the DNA that the bulk of the interbreeding occurred between 40 and 80,000 years ago. Well, about 55,000 years ago, kind of in the middle of that, the climate had changed so that the game was pushed southward, that Neanderthals in Europe were foraging, so they came southward, and they would have met up with the, basically the travel patterns for modern Homo sapiens. And so apparently around 55,000 years ago, there was interbreeding between the two. And that turns out that's not even the end of the story. Because one of the things that we've been really interested in is what happened in Europe, because there were Neanderthals there. And then Homo sapiens showed up and the Neanderthals disappeared. I mean, what happened? Did we kill them in a war? Did we interbreed and them as us? Well, obviously not if we only have 1 or 2% Neanderthal genes. Did we outcompete them? What happened to Neanderthals? And so there's always been interest in finding some place where cave used by Neanderthals for a while and then Homo sapiens. And those transition periods seem to be, for the most part, around 40 to 45,000 years ago. Well, one cave that's very well known in southern Siberia, this is summertime, so it looks pretty good in Siberia, this is called Denis's Cave. There was a hermit in the 17th century named Dennis, and the name stuck. I guess it's kind of like Monkey Junction. You know, you got a name and there it goes. But this is on a hillside overlooking a large valley, a wide valley where you see there'd be a lot of game, you know, that these guys would hunt down in there. A really nice, a sweet location for a cave. Anyway, so Neanderthals lived there for over 100,000 years. And then it was a period where Homo sapiens and then Neanderthals and then Homo sapiens after that. So there's been a lot of interest in looking at what's happening in that 40 to 45,000 year range, and then try to find bones and see if you can find enough DNA that you can sequence it and figure out who's there. So the end of a finger bone off of a child was sequenced in 2008, and it turned out it wasn't Neanderthal and it wasn't Homo sapiens. It was a third species that we had absolutely no idea about. And that was all we knew, DNA there. Much more similar to Neanderthal than to us, but clearly, you know, quite different, you know, different enough, if you will, from Neanderthal. They end up naming it after the cave, Dennis's cave. This is Homo denisova. And so we knew almost nothing about those, but now if you look in people alive today, there are people who have Denisovan genes. Mostly, here's my map. Some in India, especially the eastern coast of India, and then far western Asia, and especially Pacific Islanders and Aborigines in Australia. Some of them have up to 7% of Denisovan genes. So is that a good thing? I mean, do you feel good having, you know, Neanderthal or Denisova genes? Actually, I think that's kind of cool. I mean, I think of them as genetic upgrades, because you got to imagine what things were like. So imagine that these guys are leaving Africa, heading across here, and they're heading into habitat environments they are not adapted for. And they meet up with some friendly folks, hopefully they were friendly, that have been there for a couple 100,000 years, and they're really much better adapted at this. And guess what? There's some babies being born, and the women who were Homo sapiens that got a hybrid kid, and they moved on with them. Now they've got children that have half Neanderthal alleles. Genetic upgrades. They're going to be better adapted to this new environment they're in. So what do we get? I mean, what do we get? Well, it turns out that if you and I each have 1 or 2% Neanderthal genes, we probably don't have the same genes. Because scattered amongst different groups of people alive today is about half of the DNA that Neanderthals have. But among the things that most people have, genes that make the skin tougher, genes that that affect pigmentation, both in the skin and the eyes and the hair, and many genes of the immune system. And that's the one that makes the most sense. In a sense, they've evolved immunity to challenges that are around there. You come in, you know, you don't have any virus protection for your computer. You come in and essentially piggyback off of somebody else's. In fact, once this happened, you can imagine medical researchers would look at medical conditions and Neanderthal DNA and look for correlations. Does having this gene predispose you to a problem or make you be less likely to have that problem? And they find a couple more every year. And some of the things, it seems that the Neanderthal genes help. Some of them it hurts. But some of them, one of the things, there's a gene that to some extent predisposes an individual to type 2 diabetes. Now, that basically means you can't deal with high levels of glucose in your bloodstream. Today, that's probably a much bigger problem than it was 50,000 years ago, where people were way, way more likely to starve to death. And it may have even been that it was neutral or maybe even somewhat adaptive. So there are a number of genes that are associated there. In terms of Denisova, there are a bunch of genes associated with the immune system, but also genes that help adapt to deal with cold and altitude. Those Tibetan Sherpa guys that go up when people want to climb Mount Everest, they have a gene called EPAS1, EPAS1, that makes their blood much more efficient at carrying oxygen when there's hardly any oxygen in the air. Now, if you're saying, well, wait a minute, my ancestors stayed in Africa, don't I get any genetic upgrades? Well, actually, you've probably got some too, because there are people in Africa who stayed in Africa who have genes that the folks who left Africa 100,000 years ago didn't have. And so there was clearly one or more species, races, lineages, whatever you want to call them, that there was interbreeding that went on more recently than that. We don't know any more about them because Africa, warm, wet, see, that's a bad thing. If you want to find out about your ancestors, you should have told them to die and fall into a freezer and stay frozen until somebody finds them. So up north where it's colder, the chances of finding even a tiny amount of DNA to work with are much, much, much greater. Okay? So what's the relationship between these three species? Well, this is pretty much how it looks as of now. And there's more stuff on here. About 650,000 years ago, there was a split between the lineage leading to us and the lineage leading to both Denisova and Neanderthals. And then about 450,000 years ago, a split between those two. Basically, it may well have been like one group, Denisova kept moving east, Neanderthals stayed more or less in Europe, and a lack of gene flow between them in the time after that. So those two groups are much more similar. Okay? So what happened when back in Europe? I mean, that's one of the things people wanted to know. By about 45,000 years ago, Homo sapiens moved into Europe to stay. Neanderthals weren't doing well. Unfortunately, climate change, again, was shaking up things. It was becoming cooler and drier, and so what was more or less a forested Europe was becoming more of grasslands. That's not a good thing if you have to sneak up on, elephants and rhinos to stab them with spears. You need cover. You don't need to be in a forest, but you want some solid cover better than, a grassland. And so by 45,000 years ago, Neanderthals' population was way down, and they were found mostly in little pockets, probably where where forests still remained, and especially along the western coast where there were more forests. And looking at the genetics of those groups suggested they were really inbred. So we didn't have much to say about what was going on with Neanderthals. When we showed up, we had a little better weapons. We threw spears. That seems like a good idea. Had bows and arrows, and so they didn't have to get as close. What it comes down to for Neanderthals, again, most of it was about climate change. To the extent that our competition had anything to do with it, maybe a little bit. The fact that we probably, once people started moving into Europe, we had greater numbers. So in that sense, the competitive edge would likely go to us as well. So no warfare. All right, so that's Africa and Europe and Asia and Australia. We haven't talked about the Americas yet. What happened there? Well, we know that modern Homo sapiens got to eastern Siberia, almost over here, by 45,000 years ago. The problem is there was a glacier across the top here, what we think of as northern Alaska and northern Canada, with ice 2 or 3 miles thick, which is to say nobody's coming in. And then about 13,000 years ago, turns out it was 2 glaciers, and they started moving in opposite directions, and so you end up with this wide passageway in between them. Now the passageway from Asia to to North America was about 1,000 miles wide already, because so much ice was tied up in the water was tied up in ice. So it was easy to, they could have walked to North America, but they couldn't get past those glaciers. Once they opened up, then you can imagine that game is going to follow down here, and people hunting the game were going to follow them as well. And our first evidence of them comes from fairly far south, near a little town of Clovis, New Mexico. There are not a lot of human remains found there, but there are a lot of a particular type of spear point. These guys were mammoth hunters. And this type of spear point has come to be called a Clovis point, and the people, Clovis people. And so they couldn't come down until after 13,000 years ago, and that made pretty good sense. It explained what we knew until we found out more stuff. Since then, we've found fossil remains from Florida that are 14,500 years ago, and the coast of Peru 14,500 years ago, and southern Mexico 13,500 years ago, which is to say they didn't come here between the glaciers. And so the question was, did they come from Europe or did they come from Asia? And genetically, we can tell they came from Asia. Not really closely related to the mammoth hunters, but not exactly them. And they came earlier. Our best thinking about this is that they came down along the coast. Do you know what kelp is? Kelp's not a plant, but it's an algae, and it grows really fast, and it creates what people call kelp forest. I mean, if you look at this, this is a rich environment. You can imagine lots of little critters that are either eating the kelp or hiding in the kelp, and bigger things that are eating the kelp or hunting the things that are hiding in the kelp. And that, and you may be more familiar with the top view. Cute little sea otter tied off there. Again, so the kelp have floats, so they keep the fronds sticking upward. If you can forage along this kelp forest, you could move all the way down the coast. This is going to be called the Kelp Highway. So people coming along here, by the time you get to what's now the United States, there were rivers moving east-west that could take you as far as the Mississippi, which would get you to the Gulf. And we don't know when this happened exactly, but seemingly by 18 to 20,000 years ago, people started arriving in North America that way. And so that's pretty much the end of the biological story. Well, the question, I guess, is, when did we become us? And it kind of depends. Basically, we were us 200,000 years, at least by 200,000 years ago. Do you want your genetic upgrades? Well, maybe you have to wait until 50,000 years ago, but then we're still us. All the things that people talk about, that make a big deal about in terms of race, that's really just about where your ancestors spent the last couple thousand years. And it seems to be really important to people, but again, in a biological sense, the story, we were us a long time ago. So I'm done now. The rest of your courses begin. This is when history class and Soc class and math class, all those other silly classes you take when you're not in biology. So I'm going to stop now, and thanks for playing.